I was going to say I appreciate your being here, but I don't have to say that. This is all your. These are parents, grandparents, great grandparents that we've all come there. They're our forebears that we're here to honor together. I want to start with. I want to tell you who these people are, because for most of you, you've probably, some of you are the oldest ones, the oldest grandchildren have perhaps knew my parents and knew of them. But for most of you, you don't know other than just the hearing names and stories. And so I want to tell their stories, and I'm going to do it in greater detail than I might otherwise, and even at the risk of in terms of the little ones trying their patience, because you probably have never heard the story, and you probably will never hear it again. If I don't tell it to you now, you won't know who they are, where they come from, what their history is. And not only that, you're going to hear names that will all of a sudden sound familiar. And they've come back from earlier history, and hopefully they will continue as these names continue to live. And so, and I think Racheli is going to, the reason I'm going to do this at greater length than I would otherwise, because we're going to memorialize it here with our various photographers so that we can add it to the collection. As you know, I'm going to start by talking about my father, because we know more about my father because we actually sat him down, and some of you have heard the interview with him, which is an hour or so or more, and he's quite articulate and quite elaborate and sentimental. And if you, based on what I say today, I invite you to kind of listen it to yourself and just hear the intonations in his voice, and as he goes through some of these memories of his childhood. My mother, some of you know, you've seen the video of her describing how the adventure for her to be able to convince the Nazi officials to allow my father to come to Germany so they could leave Germany. But we don't have anything like that equivalent for her, of her talking about her earlier days in her childhood, so I don't have as much to say. With that introduction, my father was Leib Leo Goldberg. His father was Shlomo Zalman Braunfeld. My father was Leib Leo Goldberg. His father was Shlomo Zalman Braunfeld. You'll hear a little how that comes about in a few minutes.
How do you spell Shlomo? Right?
Yes. Shlomo Zalman was born in Rupshitz, which was next to Tarnov in Galicia, and I actually have a map here which I'll share with you later. Some of this has been enriched by the fact that Aunt Batsheva and I took the trip to Poland with Ephraim and Yocheved and the BRS group, and so some of this came more alive, and we learned a lot more, and I did a lot more research. And so that town was next to Tarnov. In the map you'll see that a lot of these towns in Poland were fairly close to one another, so you'll hear a lot of different names, but they were not far, and so people knew one another and traveled easily. Shlomo Zalman's father was Chaim, and I don't know, and I couldn't find anywhere what his mother's name. And Shlomo Zalman marries Shendel Moskowitz, who comes from Tarnov, which is close to where he grew up, and her parents are Leib and Sarah. Shlomo has brothers, Max and Harry, and he has a sister, Anna, all of whom go to America in the early 1900s and are here from that period of time. And I knew them growing up. I knew them and their children, and even Savta and Aunt Batsheva. We spent time with them, and the families were, certainly at the beginning, were very close. Shendel, his wife, has 12 brothers and sisters, some of whom go to America and settle in all places in Jersey City and in Newark. There was Tantas Anna and Tanta Rosa and Uncle Herman, and they come into the story a little later on as well. On July 17th, 1910, my father is born, and he's named Leib Leo after his grandfather, after Shendel's father, who was Leib. And you'll see a lot of the names that are used there. There are double names. There's a Hebrew name and a Yiddish name, in some cases a German name. So some of the people that we'll hear about actually have 3 different names. My father eventually has 3 brothers and a sister. Chaim Heinrich is born in 1914, and he's named for Shlomo Zalman's father, Chaim. Menachem, Max, is born in 1918. Sarah is born in 1919, and she's named for Shandel's mother. And then Ephraim, Philip, or Fishel, was born in 1920. Shlomo Zalman and his wife Shandel live in the Tarnov region, and that's where they are with their children. Until 1911, when my father was 1 year old, Shlomo is a soap maker, and he can't find work in Poland. So they moved to Zabrach, Czechoslovakia, which when you look at the map is just kind of like on the other side of the border from Poland, not very far away, where he's a foreman in a soap factory until his job is eliminated. His uncle Mendel tells him to move to Mendelstown in Czechoslovakia, where he thinks there'll be more opportunities. And Shlomo Zalman goes and he starts a business buying animal skins, rabbits and cows and goats. And then he expands it because there's a big metal factory manufacturer in Czechoslovakia, and so he's able to buy and sell scrap metal that comes out of the factory. In 1914, the beginning of World War I, he's drafted into the army, and he serves in the army until the end of World War I in 1918, when he returns home to his family and to his business that is in Czechoslovakia. Shlomo actually...
He drafted into the Axis power, the German army.
Yeah, World War I. Who was
World
he
War
fighting
I.
for?
The Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Yeah, Austria.
Right.
Yes.
Austro-Hungarian
Yes.
Empire.
Yes.
Against the Allies.
Right.
Right.
Now, what I didn't realize is Shlomo Zalman has a twin brother who lived in Tarnov with his aunt Giselle. So I didn't know that we had any twins in on my side of the family. In 1925, my father's mother Sarah dies from a rheumatic heart after a 2-week illness, so it goes very quickly, leaving my father at the age of 15, and his siblings aged 11, 7, 6, and 5. He used to describe how, after his mother died, how he and his brothers would say Kaddish and Shul. They'd go to the Western Wall together, and the 4 of them would say Kaddish, 15, 11, 7, and 5, and they would say Kaddish, and the Shul would cry, just seeing these boys who have lost their mother and they're on their own. In 1926, that's a year after Sarah dies, Sarah's brother Philip comes to Czechoslovakia for the Hakamat Matzeva, for his sister, and he sees how difficult it is for his brother-in-law raising these 5 children on his own, and he suggests to my father, the oldest, that he should come back with Philip to Berlin, where he lives, where he could learn a trade and be there and make it a little bit easier for my father. So that's what he does in 1927.
How old is he? I'm sorry, how old is
So
he now?
1927, he's born in 1910, so he's 17 years old. He goes to Berlin and becomes an apprentice in a large department store in the Spandau Market area of Berlin. Now I've been there. Spandau is still there. It's still a commercial center in Berlin to this day. He works there. He finishes his apprenticeship in 2 years, and his visa expires in 1929, and he returns to Poland for a new passport. To get his new passport, he brings his Polish birth certificate, because remember he was born in Poland before he went to Czechoslovakia. Birth certificate said Leib Leo Braunfeld Rechter Goldberg, which means that they're saying on the birth certificate that he was born of a father whose last name was Braunfeld and his mother's maiden name was Goldberg, and therefore they said you're going to be Leib Leo Goldberg. That's what they put on his Polish passport. He doesn't really care because all he wants to do is be able to get back into Germany. But the interesting thing is his whole family, his father and his brothers, everybody changes their name to Goldberg because of this, and they all became known as Goldberg.
Huh. I didn't know that.
Huh. When my father returns to Berlin...
Wait, until that time he was Braunfeld.
Yes, until that time everybody was Braunfeld.
That's crazy.
That changes everything. I was going to go back to Braunfeld.
When my father returns to Berlin, he starts his own business with a stand in this Spandau outdoor market that you kind of see it here.
I want to make a small comment. There's a very nice article. One of the few businesses that Jews dominated the garment industry in Berlin at that time and there was tremendous anti-Semitism outside of Berlin. So they actually came to Berlin to escape anti-Semitism, and that was one of the things the Nazis clung on to, was this Jewish domination of the garment industry that Grandpa worked in Berlin.
Right. His business, he sold women's stockings and underwear. That was his little piece of the market, you understand? And I remember with a smile, he would remember, because we're talking now about 1930,
Right.
and just about then, women's nylon stockings were invented. Nylon was a new product that came out of DuPont in the United States. So every Friday, he said, business was terrific, because the women would come out of their offices and wherever they worked, and they would stop on payday, and they would buy their nylon stockings, so they'd be ready for the socializing on the weekend. So that was his big day. Meanwhile, in 1928, his father remarries, and who does he marry? He marries Sarah's sister, his wife's sister, who is also a widow with 2 children. So now they have like a total of 7 children between them, and apparently it was a happy marriage, my father would tell me. When my father returns from Berlin with his new passport, when he started out his new business, he lives with his uncle Philip, who had encouraged him to come back to Berlin, and then Uncle Philip says, you know, it's really time for you to move on, and he rents his own rooms. But every year from 1930 to 1933, he would return to Czechoslovakia to visit his father and his brothers and his sister.
And Tarna.
Right.
His father who had since remarried.
Yes, his father who had since remarried. In 1933, my father meets my mother at a dance.
Oh,
Okay, so let's go a little bit and talk about my mother.
that's a good dancer.
So my mother, Rachela Rosa, was born in Poland on March 14th, 1914. Her father was Shalom David Greenspan, and her mother was Sarah Tiber.
As in Sarah.
Right. So Shalom's parents were Yaakov and Gittel, not names that appear anywhere in the family. And
Tar Gittel.
cousin
Saba, I'm Gittel.
cousin Yaakov. Right.
Saba, that's my middle name. I'm Gittel.
You're Gittel.
Yeah.
That's good. It's a good name.
We'll go with that.
Now, Sarah's parents,
Thank you.
right? So my mother's mother is Sarah, and Sarah's parents are Moshe Aaron Tiber
Sabas name.
and Golda Lubinsky. So if you want, so that's the Lubinsky name you hear about. That's the Tiber name you hear about. And we know someone on Lubinsky side, they were involved in textiles. They had a plaid that was named after them, a certain special pattern.
That was
Władysławski
Władysławski.
The Władysławski plaid.
That's because Lodz was the center of textiles all of Poland.
All right?
They were from Lodz.
So therefore, you understand why I'm named Moshe Aaron after my grandfather, and my sister Sonia was named Shandel Golda after her 2 grandmothers. His parents were Moshe Aaron Tiber and Golda Lubinsky.
Gold.
All right. So the Golda was from my mother's mother, and the Shandel was from my father. So the 2 grandmothers on the side. That's where her name comes from.
From her 2
Shalom Zalman and Sarah live in Kalisz, Poland, which is in that same general area. And their first child is Chaim, Uncle Chaim, who was born first. My mother was born in 1914. Chaim is a year or 2 older. I don't remember exactly.
How do you know 1914? Where did you get that from? 1914?
I have papers.
Because I remember it being 1910 also.
I thought they were both 1910,
All of you
but
who
the papers show
remember
that
Aunt Rachel
1914.
and Rachel
She never knew,
father
Grandpa. Really
was
never divulged trade.
Or unless the papers were not necessarily accurate. Unless somebody said, when were you born? And she did. She liked being 4 years younger.
Didn't
So,
she tell all her friends in Bayonne? Didn't they all think she was 5 years?
yes, that she was 4 or 5 years
There
younger.
was always this.
Judy, you remember that?
A few years after my mother is born, her family moves to Berlin. I have no idea how or why that comes about, and whether it's related to anti-Semitism, whether it's related to business, and I also don't know. I have no idea what her parents' business interests were, what her father did, either in Poland or in Europe. That's how my mother gets to Berlin. She's only a few years old, and she really grows up.
As a German.
In Germany, right?
She's a German.
Yeah, she grows up in Germany, and most of her schooling is in Germany as well.
Gymnasia.
That's right.
What did she say? I'm from the gymnasium.
So,
Yes. She finished
so
gymnasia.
let's go back.
Bagrut.
Let's go back now to how they met. So my father is now a young single man living in Berlin, and he's kind of he's there for Parnassa, but he's also there. It's time.
He has a
He has a Parnassa.
Drew's making a point now.
So it's ready to get married. So my father tells me he went to dancing school, so that he would be proficient in dancing, and therefore that's
Why?
because that's the social life. I guess you met in the Jewish community. You met at dancing, so you wanted to be a good dancer, so he could invite the ladies to dance.
It was a different world then.
So.
That's a good way to.
And my mother was a good dancer. She was always a good dancer. It was always important to her. She was a popular girl, my father said, but he won her over. Now, my father also had the advantage. He had, even though he was born in Poland, remember, he was raised in Czechoslovakia, which was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So he had a quality education, and he learned German in school. So when he came to Germany, when he came to Berlin, he was also proficient in Germany. And he really was, all their life, even their married life, he was the one, he was much more comfortable with words and writing. He was the one that wrote the letters to everybody, and his handwriting was quite nice. They dated for a few months, and then he was invited to my mother's house to meet her mother and father, and her brother,
In Berlin.
Kaya, in Berlin.
He was
right.
Goldberg at this point. He was no longer brother.
He's Goldberg.
She married a Goldberg.
He's Goldberg.
Now, were
That's
they middle class? How would you describe? Where did they
I have
live?
no idea.
Jewish neighborhoods.
Remember, I don't.
Ellis Island.
I can tell you one thing. On the business card Uncle sent me, there were two addresses, and I looked them up. The one in Spandau, that was the thing, but there was another very beautiful, pretty far away. Yeah, a neighborhood about an hour's tram ride away, which was a really nice neighborhood. It's a beautiful neighborhood. Nice.
So my father told me he used to visit my mother and her parents every Sunday, and he brought a box of chocolate, and he remembered telling me it was Fiodoro, a very fine brand of chocolates, and the chocolates were for his future mother-in-law, not for my mother. This is the court. This is how he ingratiated himself.
All the boys
And
have to
then,
take notes.
and then after a couple months when this thing was getting serious, so my father invited my mother to meet Uncle Philip and his wife, to meet the Moskowitzes.
Also in Berlin.
Also, because they lived in Berlin. He takes a second stand before the holidays, before Easter, and he puts my mother in charge of the second stand. So they're running two stands, right?
Both lingerie, right? Both.
The same thing, selling the same stuff.
Oh my.
In 1934, they decide to get married.
The Nazis are all coming to power in '33.
Correct.
Right, okay.
Correct.
How long were they dating?
Just a few months. But even though they decide to get married, they can't get married right away because my father needs to get papers from Poland in order, I guess, to be able to demonstrate the things, the name, to get married in Poland.
What's their religious life?
What? I have no idea. Well, you know what? I have no idea what my mother's family's religious life was, other than if you look at the pictures, they look, you know, as Ian just said, they look from. But you know what, my mother, I don't remember my mother talking so much, but on the tape, if you hear my father has very warm memories of his mother baking for Shabbos and hiding the cakes in the closet, and he and his brothers and sister finding them and eating them before Shabbos.
Also, Smirot, they used to sing.
Smirot, and also, I'll get to later, his affection for Yom Tov, particularly for Pesach and for Yom Kippur. So he clearly came from a rich life, and I'll come to that when I get to
But Grandma told me that when the way they acted in Germany wasn't the way they acted when they went back to Poland. That was from her mouth that I heard. That there was a different way of acting. They were very, and also Lodge was in the sphere of influence of the Germans, and people who wanted to get ahead. It was like leaving Europe and going to America. You leave Lodge, you go to Berlin, you're going to get a better life. But that was the idea.
So this is the spring, and they decide to get married. but Sarah, my mother's mother, decides she can't make a wedding that quick before Pesach. All right, so they can't get married right away, but they have to. In a lot of these countries, and it still exists today in Canada, you kind of have to register with the civil authorities if you want to get married. And so the only date they can get married, they get married in February in City Hall in a civil ceremony.
Wow.
And then, but because his mother-in-law didn't want to make the wedding before Pesach, they don't get married. They're religious until Lag BaOmer. So they're married on Lag BaOmer, May 3rd, 1934.
February and May.
This is grandma and grandpa.
This is Grandma and Grandpa.
Lag BaOmer.
And ceremony is in the show, but the party is in their home because of the Nazis, they can't have a big public celebration.
Really? Wow.
This is their wedding invitation.
Oh wow.
Wow. Oh, kol hakavod.
This is their wedding invitation.
How'd you pull that one?
And this is, what's interesting, I'll pass it around in just a minute, but you'll see, it says, Shulam Grinspan und Frau geboren Tiber, right? So that's Shulam, it was
Grandma's father
so it was Shalom David, called himself Shalom,
Right.
even though we all know him as kind of Shalom David, and his wife, whose maiden name was Tiber. They don't have her first name, but they just, and on the other side it says Solomon Goldberg, right? So that's Shlomo Goldberg und Frau, and his wife. They don't say more because remember, because
she wasn't the mother.
correct, because this was the second married.
Ah.
And you'll figure out the German. And for those who sometimes argue whether her name was Rosa or Rose,
Yes, all the time.
you'll see it says Rosa.
Yes.
And Leo.
Saba, let me put a picture on the family WhatsApp.
No, then I
So
forgot
we'll
my
pick,
middle name
just be
is
careful.
Did
Tomorrow, you're not named after me. Okay.
His uncle
Just, you know,
Philip comes with his wife, but his family, his father can't come from Poland into Germany. They don't go on any honeymoon. My mother moves into my father's apartment, and then they move into Spandau where the business was. He said it was a nice apartment. They had new furniture, and right away they decided that they wanted to go to the U.S. because they see what was happening. Pardon me?
Yes, we're
Fine,
comfortable.
yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. They want to go to the U.S. and my mother's mother, his father was very upset. His mother-in-law, because she and Grandma were very close, and the idea of them separating and they're going to America and leaving her behind, even before we know all what's going to happen with the Nazis, was disturbing to her. But they're determined to go.
Oh,
Howard,
way back when? Kilo in 1934?
1935, yes.
35. They decided to go to America.
They got
already.
married, they're already going to go, they're leaving, they know they're going to leave.
Right, right. And what enables it? How are they able to go to
cousins.
America? Because I told you they have uncles and aunts on both sides that are
Went to
in.
America a long time ago.
Correct.
1900.
Why
Correct.
did they want to go to America?
Because things
To
were
leave.
bad, the Nazis had come to power.
And so you need to come to America. You need to have a sponsor. You need to have somebody that's going to sign the papers and guarantee the Americans that you won't become dependent on them, that you will be able to make your own living, or they will help you. And so they start that process actually through his mother's side. Remember, I said that he had on the Braunfeld side, he had Max and Harry, and he knew they were there, but he didn't know where they were. He didn't know how to reach them. He didn't find that out until after he came to America and he met other relatives who pointed him in the right direction. So he got his papers signed by his tante Hannah, who lived in Jersey City. And that's why they wind up in Jersey City.
One other thing, when Ian and I just went to Ellis Island, when you see all the trains, unbelievably enough, when the immigrants come, one of them goes right to Jersey City. It's unbelievable. Right off Ellis Island, right to Jersey City.
So we're kind of in 1935. So a couple things happened in 1935.
My mom was born.
August 7th, your mother is born on Erev Tisha B'Av, and she's named Shandel. She's named Shandel Golda for two grandmothers. But Shandel had another name. She was also known as Sabina, and that's why In English, her mother, her name was Sonia Sabina. Sabina Sonia. So that's how all those names come together. 1935, Uncle Chaim marries Aunt Rachel, and they leave Germany to go to Israel.
34.
It leaves actually Poland.
34.
No, 34 he leaves Germany, but he goes to Poland. In 35 they make Aliyah.
So how do we
I thought he
remember
came
this?
before her.
No, because in 85 they had a 50th wedding anniversary
Remember.
and the celebration of the 50th year of our Aliyah.
Right.
And they had printed invitations, and they had a big, beautiful party. So that was
I was
1935.
there. Yeah.
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 No, 35 is wedding.
Ty was 1 year old. That's how it's saying.
After the, so he said his family couldn't come to Berlin to the wedding. So in 1936, when Sonia's 1 year old, he sends my mother and his daughter Sonia. They go to Czechoslovakia for a month,
Country.
right? So that to meet all the rest of the family, and that was the last time that anybody saw one another. It was when she went to Czechoslovakia. Pardon me?
No, with him.
No. He stayed in Berlin. I guess he's running the business. He sends his my mother
For the summer.
and Sonny for the
With
summer.
Sonny to
With
show
Sonny,
Sonny
right.
to
And they
everybody.
spend their time, and Sonny used to talk about that.
Right.
She remembered that? How old was she?
1 year.
How could she talk about it? She was 1 year old.
No, she
Yeah,
just,
later on.
it's not that she remembered it,
Grandma
but
told
she
her
grew
about
up
it.
knowing that she had been brought
To
to
there.
see
Okay.
her.
Where?
No, she went to
This
Czechoslovakia.
is the
His
country.
father.
It's more like the country.
Was that Tarnow was in
Father's-
Czechoslovakia?
Tarnow was in Poland.
Oh. So who was in
They were over the
Czechoslovakia?
border.
His father, remember?
Merish Astrau. Merish.
Yeah, he was born in Tarnow and raised in Tarnow. They go to Czechoslovakia, but remember, they go back to Tarnow before the Shoah.
Right. Okay.
What, they left Czechoslovakia, went back to
They're
Poland?
getting bad in Poland and in Germany. His father
I might say.
and his siblings, they leave Czechoslovakia and they go back to Tarnov
That I didn't know.
because his second wife, Irma, is from Tarnov, and because there's a lot of other family there. Okay, that's mostly the pleasant part of their growing up and their meeting. Then comes November 1938, and it's Kristallnacht, right? And a man named Herschel Greenspahn assassinates
Same
the
name.
German ambassador, same name. The Germans come and
Archduke.
they arrest my mother because they think the same name, Greenspahn. Could they be? Maybe she's related to this guy, and then they're convinced that she's not, and she's released. So that's November 1938, and that was November 9th.
They
and-
arrested my mother?
Grandma.
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 So what does that mean?
They
Bring
took
her
her. They took her
over.
for questioning.
Took her
They
down to the
bring
station.
her, right,
With the baby?
With the baby.
Sapo.
Right. That's November 9th and 10th is Kristallnacht.
Grandpa was still there? He was in the concentration camp.
No. Who?
Grandpa was.
No, he's there. He's home.
No, he got beaten up in Kristallnacht.
That, who's hear that?
What? I heard it on the
You're right. No, I missed a date, but it's
When
now
did
it's
when
now
did
what
he
you're
get
thinking.
deported back to Poland?
Let me back up.
Alright, hold on.
Hang on. Let me set the record straight.
Hold on.
There's two parts. In 1936, on June 6, 1936, that's before Kristallnacht, there was a big pogrom before Kristallnacht, and they wiped out the Spandau market, the stands, and he ruined all his merchandise. They beat him up. He damaged his spine, which was a problem for him all his life, back pain. And at that point, even this Uncle Philip Moskowitz and his wife and his son go to Brussels and then to Israel. So they're wind up in Israel. I never heard that. I don't know where they are.
Here,
What?
well, I don't
The
think
sen- right.
No, but I mean the family.
A year later is Kristallnacht, November 9th and 10th. And on November 30th, 1938, he says very clearly on the tape at 3 o'clock in the morning, the Nazis come, they round up all the Polish Jews, and they bring them to the German-Polish border,
all the men.
all the men.
What date is
38.
this?
Wait, this is
1938.
your father, God.
Yeah.
And so he goes with his father-in-law, because his father-in-law is also
Right.
a Polish national.
Your mother's father.
My mother's father. Right. They crossed the Polish border, and there's a committee of Jews from who are meeting the people, the local in Poland. They pick up the people and they bring them into Poland, and they find them places for them to stay.
It wasn't a
Now-
concentration camp.
No,
No.
they
No
were
man's
dumped into no man's land.
No man's land.
And they were,
So the
it
Jews-
wasn't so fast as this happened. They were jumped into no man's
Yeah.
land and they were
They were there until
and
people
Jews-
organized themselves because nobody
The Jews
expected.
did all this. They arranged.
somehow,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Polish Jews found that German Jews had been,
Right.
Polish Jews.
Specifically Polish Jews.
anybody
it was-
holding a
That's what I
Polish
thought.
It was
Any
a
Polish person who was in
was-
Germany.
It was a passports of all the people who were no longer living in Poland, living in Germany. Germany then comes along and says, if you're not a German national, we're throwing you out and go back to Poland. So they're in a no man's land because they
With no
can't,
passports. No
with
paper.
no passports, and they, right, not like.
They were not belonging to either
Right.
Poland or Germany, they're both being rejected.
Why didn't they move the women? Why did they leave
They were the Germans. This was their way just to get rid of the men, right? Because those were the
Kind of like Paro.
those were
with
the threats also.
With the boys.
My mother and Sonny go to move in with my mother's mother, right? Because her husband has now also been sent out, and my mother's husband has been sent out, so they move in with her mother. Now, meanwhile, my father is in Poland, and he knows his visa application is in process. Because they've done through all the applications, and they have the sponsorship, and they're just waiting for the approval to be able to.
Go to America.
Right. So he needs his visa approved, and then they will book a place on a ship, and they will sail to America. But he's now in Poland, and he has to get back to Germany. He needs approval for the Germans for him to get back, to go back from Poland into Germany. So that is a famous story in the family. You see my mother's video of what she did. I'm not going to go through that whole thing today, but a series of courageous events, and my mother facing nose to nose the German authorities. She manages to get what they used to call the red stamp, and they used to say that he was the first Polish Jew to get the red stamp that allowed them to go from Poland and return to Germany. That's February 1939.
and can I just add that everybody in this room, I think except for myself, Ruthie, Faith, are only here because of your mother's courage. Everybody standing here and sitting here are only here today because of your mother's actions that day.
Meanwhile, knowing that they're waiting for the visa application, my mother books passage to America on the SS Manhattan, which is the United States shipping line.
That's right. That was the last voyage, by the way.
They leave. So my father comes back in February 1939, on April 3rd, my father comes back. He goes to the U.S. consulate to get his visa, which is they've been waiting for, and then March, April, within 2 months, they're on the ship. April 3rd, 1939, they leave. And 5 months later, on September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland, and World War II was happening.
That whole thing of from when he got back into Germany to get on the ship, how long do you guesstimate that whole situation? He gets the red stamp.
It's just it's not that long, because remember, he leaves, he's thrown out of Germany in November 1938, and in February 1939, he's going back. So it's 4 or 5 months.
Right, and
So-
this whole thing transpires.
So,
And you don't know about getting the ticket? Wasn't hard. There's no stories about that. Getting the.
no. So this is the SS Manhattan. I'll show you this. And this is the manifest. This is the list of passengers that were on the ship. And
Was this among Grandma and Grandpa's
yeah,
possessions?
and you'll see, if you look for, I'm opening to the page, I'll put the picture on that page. It lists every passenger, and it's in all alphabetical order, and it says Mr. Leib Goldberg, Mrs. Goldberg, and Miss Sabine Goldberg. And if you look in the back, You can see that they obviously very social on the ship. It's a 5-day voyage to get from Hamburg into New York, and so they're collecting autographs and messages from people
This
that
boat
they met.
wasn't like a Virgin's.
No, this was a fancy liner, ocean liner.
This was an ocean liner. So they take, remember,
Is that possible?
He said they kept it on the table when we did it.
they left,
When you did it, you did it.
Surreal.
I left on April 3rd. I'm pretty sure this was in the back. I wrote it down, so maybe it's 6 days. It's something like that. It's not. It's less than a week. It's less than a week. And remember, they're not allowed to take much when they leave. They can't take money or valuables. So therefore, you sell all that and you use that to buy your ticket, which is how they can afford to go onto the ship. Was when they were before he leaves, when they were in no man's land, he actually went to Kutnow to see his father-in-law. He didn't go to Tarnov to see his father and his brothers because he was afraid that he'd be drafted into the Polish army. So he just kind of stayed where he was until they left.
Yeah.
Yep. So they come to America in 1939. They move to Jersey City because that's where the Tanta Hannah is. Who sponsored them, where they're able to establish a life. He wrote to his father and to his in-laws until 1942. He wrote letters.
And the mail was getting through.
For a period of time, it was getting through. But in 1945, after the war, all the letters that couldn't be delivered were returned. And so he knows that after 1942, nothing was going through anymore. They're amazing letters. Had the letters. The envelopes are actually stamped with a swastika, and and it says in Germany, that it was held in Paris.
You know what happened to Grandma's parents? Because we don't know what happened to her mom and the dad. The dad was in Poland, the mom's in Berlin, and they're leaving now.
Good question. After my mother leaves,
Right.
her mother goes to Poland to be with her husband. So they're all together in
And did they
Tarnow.
make it back to Lodge, to the best of our knowledge?
No, Lodge does not come up in the discussion. They believe that they were killed in 1942. Nobody gave specific testimony, but there were you kind of get reports that the Jews of so and so in that area were killed at a certain point in time. They come here. They're living in Jersey City. They come in 1939. World War II starts. They're in America. So my father is working in the shipyard. That's how it does his service. And in order to survive as well, they also do piecework. They bring belts home at night and they sew buckles onto the belts, and they get paid 25 cents a belt. This is the card that they send in. It reports how many buckles they have sewn in and how much money they're making, and that's how they're kind of surviving. We do what my father earns in the shipyard, and they do both earn from the buckles until my father comes home one day and my mother tells him, "Congratulations, Leo, you're a grocer." She had bought a grocery store
On the money that they
while he was gone. I guess from the money that they had saved, wherever it came. It was on Myrtle Avenue. It was relocated right next to a little shul, and he had this grocery store for years, and then he moved into a bigger grocery store. It was a hard life. Particularly in the early years, there was tremendous uncertainty about, obviously, what happened to all their family. And even afterwards, when it was clear that their family had not survived, there was a tremendous amount of guilt, particularly for my mother having left her mother behind. In 1945, I'm born because of my sister, who kept begging my mother for another child. My mother was not inclined, with all that she had gone through, to have another child, but the story is that she found my sister at the window of the apartment, looking outside, talking to God, praying for a brother. And when my mother saw that, she couldn't resist, and she, I wouldn't say reluctantly, she agreed to have another child, which turned out to be me.
We also wouldn't be here if that
Yes,
happened.
that was an important part also.
That's right. It was like Miriam.
Miriam.
There was a,
And he's a Moshe.
Right, exactly.
Because just like Miriam and
No,
her
but,
parents.
during the grocery store, they managed, family was important, they worked hard, Sunday was the day, my parents never had a car, so we always went every place on public transportation. From Jersey City, we'd take the Hudson Tubes into Lower Manhattan, and then we'd take the subways wherever we were going, and we would spend Sundays with family. We'd spend it with the Tybers, many of whom survived, they were very close with, and with the Moskowitzes,
And a few rabbinic
and
teachers.
Braunfelds, these uncles that I
We're in
talked about.
Moscow. I need to look into these numbers.
She was Mary's counselor.
It was important to them. I'm not quite sure why, but you come here now. Sonny's born in 1935. They come in 1939, so she's 4 years old. In a few years, she's ready for school. And it was important for them that she have a Jewish education. And Yeshiva Hudson County had just gotten started. I don't know how they knew about it. I don't know how they afforded it. That's what they said. They had very strong Jewish identity. That was important. Although the same thing was a challenge for them too. They were not necessarily shown the Shabbat.
No, but the
Because
house
nobody
was
But the
didactic in terms of kashrut.
And the holiday.
Kashrus and holidays. And
No,
so,
and
that,
places-
so Sonny goes to Yeshiva Hudson County, then she goes to Snyder High School. Sonny marries on January 20th, 1957, with this nice man named Gene Tick. Her husband's in the army, so they get married. Kind of not unlike what happens to other people. You get married and you say goodbye to your husband because he has to go back in the army, and he comes back only when he's on leave. So there's precedent for this. The-
How old are you
Wasn't an
when
officer,
she
but
got
he was an engineer.
How old are you when
So
she
he was
got
on
married?
Very good question. So I'm 12 years old when she gets married, and a year later is my bar mitzvah, and Aunt Sunny is there, very fat and pregnant. And
With?
And
With?
Right.
Raise
With?
your hand.
with this man here, with Ian. So he's named Yisrael Shlomo. The Shlomo is for the grandfather, right? Shlomo Zalman. And then comes David Avram, and David is from Shalom David, right? From my mother's father.
Menachem.
And then Jed Matthew was born. Matthew is Menachem, who was one of my father's brothers.
Right.
That was from Max. And then Melissa Sarah's born, and Sarah was from my mother's mother. And then Ephraim Chaim comes along, and he rounds it out. That's the last two brothers. Official. So all the brothers are then named. The so family was my mother. My mother was a dynamo, as you saw from her buying the store. She was very outgoing. She was very clever. She was a great businesswoman. She was very sociable. She loved to sing. She loved to dance, and she loved to talk to anybody. And she was just very outgoing. And
One interesting thing is that your father originally got her involved in business
Yes.
by setting up
Well-
the stand, and then it seemed like she
It was so
excelled in
natural for
business
her.
that she actually took to it very naturally.
she had a very good education.
And she was more aggressive in that sense in taking the lead. She was very independent, but at the same time, she was very devoted to my father. My father became ill in his early 60s, and he retired, and it was quite debilitating. She kept him at home. She cared for him. She was very devoted, and he died at the age of 68. He had complications of Alzheimer's, the respiratory failure that often comes there. He in fact was one of the first people given the diagnosis of Alzheimer's, because I had a college roommate, became a psychiatrist, guy that was at Columbia Medical School, Stuart Rudofsky, and he brought my father to their neurological institute where they were first studying this, and they put a name on it. So it was a name that wasn't it didn't provide much
Nobody
relief.
ever heard of the name before.
They lived
And I used to say Alzheimer's.
they lived a quiet life. As a Sunday was their day until he retired for socializing. But you can see what took him back to his childhood, and for all of us, were Pesach, the Seder, running the Seder, which he always did, and Yom Kippur. and that clearly brought back a lot of memories to how he lived and how he would have liked to have been able to live more in the, even when he was in Jersey City.
Right. And Uncle, also the famous sukkah. We have a sukkah store. We're in the sukkah in Brookline, and I was singing we wrote. And he started to cry. It reminded him of Europe. So you can add that to that.
So let me just kind of conclude with how we get here today, and then we can go down to the gravesite. This was my parents were buried in in Staten Island, Baron Hirsch Cemetery, a well-known cemetery, in the section that was put together by the Shul, the Myrtle Avenue Shul. They were part of all their life. And but as Aunt Batsheva and I moved when we left the New York area, went down to Florida, we'd make a point when we were up in New York once a year at least to go to the cemetery. But the thought of as more of our life was split between Modi'in and Florida, the thought that my parents would be left behind, we might make the effort to visit them once a year. But clearly, when we were gone, there would be nobody who knew where they were, or would be not that they wouldn't care, but to know where they were and to make the effort to do it. And the thought of leaving them behind was just so upsetting to me. Decided we had to do something about it. And then at the same time, the Boca Raton Synagogue bought a section here in Eretz Chaim. And that was kind of like by Sheret, that these two things should kind of come together and create the opportunity to find a resting for the place to be in Israel, but not just in Israel, to be in Eretz Chaim, to be close to their beloved daughter Shendel, and ultimately, since Aunt Batsheva and I also have purchased plots in there right next to them, and Ephraim and Yocheved have purchased plots there also. I can think of no greater pleasure for my parents, aside from being in an English-speaking cemetery. So since my mother was so social, but to know that she'd be next to their daughter, their son, and grandchildren, and actually there are plots there also, you should all know, for Missy and for Jed, which are right next to where your mother is. And they, in their wildest imagination, they never could have dreamt that they would be in Israel, be buried in Israel, that they would have so many grandchildren as well, and grandchildren and great-grandchildren in Israel. And this has got to be tremendously satisfying, not only to me, but satisfying them, to be in a country which they used to speak of, and the Karen Kayemet, the little blue and white boxes were part of our lives, and the Israel bonds were part of our lives. And it made it so real.
Yes.
Pardon me?
Yes.
What made it so real is that they had my mother and Uncle Chaim, right? And Aunt Rachel. So they connected somehow after the war. And Uncle Chaim came with Aunt Rachel to America. First time, I think, in the 1950s. They were writing. My parents were sending care packages in the 1950s when the economy here was so terrible and you needed help.
Tell them how you used to go to the post office with your mother.
Right, with packages of clothing.
To Israel.
Of clothing to Israel to kind of help out. So this was Israel was always very real for my parents because of Uncle Chaim, Aunt Rachel, and Yaakov and Tova. My parents came for the first time to Israel in 1972. These are their passports. I found their U.S. passports, which I'll pass around also, because you can see what they looked like in 1972. And in those days, they still stamped your passports, so I could see they arrived in Lud in March 1972. And in here, in my mother's handwriting, not nearly as good as my father's, you'll see on these little strips of papers, as they toured the country, she listed every place that they went. You may not be so easy to read. Migdala Emek, Balfour Forest, Kinneret Lake, Sweetwater, where Jesus had.
Is it written in
I
Hebrew?
can't even. No, it's in English. Kinneret. So you'll see this in my mother's as they tried to live it. Now this is
It was in the passport, that's where you found it?
no, I didn't find it in the fact. I found it in some other papers. But that took me back. I realized looking at the passport, I could figure out because I want to go down to the kever now, but I want to read later because that 2 years later in 1974, my father wrote about his visit to Israel and what it meant to him. I sent it out previously, and you may have seen it, but I want to share it with the kids later. And so, and in there, he also says, the letter doesn't have a date on it, but he says 2 years ago we were in Israel. So now I can piece it together knowing that was 1974. The reason that becomes relevant is my father died in 1978. So this was kind of like toward the end of his lucid period. And when we talk about it, you'll see just how eloquent he is and how much he describes it. Even as I looked at it, it was hard to believe that just a couple years after that, it was all famous. So the sun may actually be coming out. The weather's beautiful. Let's go down there, and then we'll have some more opportunity.